Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Lent Lecture. Could I suggest that we begin the evening with a brief prayer, asking God to bless our time of study and fellowship together. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. God our Father, we place ourselves in your hands, and we ask you to send your Holy Spirit to inspire and guide us tonight. Draw us closer to Jesus, your Son. Amen. I want to say a really warm welcome to everybody, both All Saints parishioners and those who are visiting. It's really terrific to have you with us, and particularly also to be able to welcome those who are joining us online tonight. This lecture is going to be, or is being live streamed as we speak. I've made my announcement about if you can't hear very well, quite simply come forward and sit at the front, and do feel free to do that at any point if as the evening goes on you find you can't hear all that well. May I welcome on your behalf Ayla Lepine, who is going to be speaking to us tonight. I think Ayla is probably one of the only people I can call to my mind who has studied theology at both St. Stephen's House and Westcott House. Is that true? So Ayla was one of the first non-ordinand students at St. Stephen's House when I was an ordinand there, when she was studying theology. She's the Associate Rector at St. James Piccadilly, and has also been the Amundsen Fellow in Religion and Art at the National Gallery, a very prestigious role. She teaches on the King's College and National Gallery MA in Christianity and the Arts, and I'm very pleased that on occasions she's brought her seminar here to All Saints to look at the building and to study it. Am I right in thinking that your PhD topic was modern responses to the Middle Ages, like the thing we're standing in now, for example? Okay, excellent. Well, I'm so pleased that Mother Ayla is going to be speaking to us tonight on this fascinating new project that the National Gallery has put together, Fruits of the Spirit, an online exhibition where you can see all sorts of pictures together that physically are hundreds of miles apart, and using those images as a way to ponder the Christian idea of the fruits of the Spirit. So without any further ado or waffling on my part, could I invite you to welcome our speaker tonight?
Thank you so much for the invitation and for your kind introduction, Father Peter. It is always a joy, a really unique and beautiful joy for me to be here at All Saints Margaret Street. I think this is the first church that I came to for Mass when I first arrived in London when I was 19 years old, and I am a little bit older than that now. And so All Saints has a particular place in my heart, my spiritual life, as well as my academic world in my ongoing research interests in the Gothic revival. As Peter described, I was, before I began my role as Associate Rector at St. James's Piccadilly, and it's lovely to see some St. James's people here, I was the Amundsen Fellow in Art and Religion at the National Gallery, and that fellowship has been going for just over 10 years now, and it enfolds itself around teaching the MA in Christianity and the Arts, which has been run through King's College London together with the National Gallery for some years. And there too, I first started as a visiting lecturer for that when I was still doing my PhD at the Courtauld Institute. And it's been really exciting over the last few years to see how that interdisciplinary program continues to grow. And there are, in fact, very few people each year who take that program who have a significant academic background in art history. Most of them are people who have backgrounds in other humanities degrees, including theology. Some are clergy, some are artists. They're from different kinds of generations and backgrounds, and it makes them a very unusual but an extremely rewarding group of people to teach. And every once in a while, there are people who are clergy and parishioners in parishes from the Diocese of London. even. And even they are remarkable people to teach and wonderful. So I warmly commend that course to you. Please do come along and be part of it if you wish. There are two other components to what I did with my really wonderful and I hope fruitful year at the National Gallery. One of them was to create two networks, one for interfaith exploration of sacred art, thinking about works of art in the National Gallery alongside themes that are really crucial for our world today. So the first one was looking at Orazio Gentileschi's The Finding of Moses, a 17th century Italian picture in the collection, alongside the theme of crossing borders. And that Orazio painting will come into what I have to share with you this evening as well, because in the Fruits of the Spirit exhibition, it stands for the theme of faithfulness, as it displays so beautifully and tenderly, but also in a very complicated way and in a very specific context. I'm really trailering it for you, so there you go. This moment of Moses' infancy. And the other network was for art historians and curators who were very determined to get to grips with really quite complex concepts in religion and theology, not only Christian, but beyond that, knowing that as stewards of collections that have all sorts of material, whether it's Christian material or Buddhist or anything else, you can't be an expert in everything. And yet people who will come to see exhibitions might have their own religious perspectives and their own social perspectives, and might hope to see themselves in some way reflected in those exhibitions. And so what we found, just sort of casting our bread on the water, making invitations and seeing what would come back, is that so far the Interfaith Network has approximately 100 people in it, and it's growing and it's become at least a little bit international, primarily Muslim, Jewish, and Christian people learning and thinking together. And the Art Historians and Curators Network has nearly 200 people in it, which was such a surprise to us. And we thought, well, this is really fascinating, because sometimes when one offers an invitation as an institution or as a parish, and you think, who knows who is out there and what they're interested in, sometimes it becomes clear that there is a real hunger and a real interest. And there are a series of public events that have been sort of brought out of those two networks, and that will continue across the years, all of which you can find online as well on the National Gallery's website. There's a film, and there are 5 shorter interventions from artists and art historians and theologians working on that theme of crossing borders, and more besides. So please do look out for the activity of that network, because it's something for everyone to participate in. And the final thing that every Amundsen Fellow has been asked to do is just what they call your project. And so it could take an enormous number of forms. People have produced films, books, events, and I had very big shoes to fill, because my predecessor produced an exhibition on sin. Some of you may have seen it. It was at the National Gallery pretty much during lockdown, actually, so it was sort of there for... Sin was at the National Gallery for a limited time only. But then sin started to travel around the country. And it's been to a number of regional collections as well, and a very exciting way to start new conversations around art and a topic that can be so challenging and so compelling for people in all sorts of ways. And so my project was this. And at this point, hold on, I'm going to start this thing, and then I'm going to start doing something that Father Peter and I discussed earlier, which is where I get to pretend to be Chris Whitty and say, next slide, please. So just one moment. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the virtual gallery is it's a really immersive experience. People seem to really enjoy it, which has been very gratifying. And when you enter it on the website, this is the first thing that you see. So that is one side of a 3-dimensional kind of prism-like 3-sided object, which, as you can see just behind it, has 2 benches. What is the point of benches in a virtual gallery where you're not going to sit down? You'll also see that there are a couple of lighting tracks on the ceiling, and that there's a hole in the roof, and that the weather is always early April, approximately 22 degrees, and partly cloudy. These sorts of discussions were really exciting for the curator colleagues at the National Gallery, in particular Susanna Avery-Quash, a marvelous mentor, and the senior curator for research at the gallery who did this project with me. and Siobhan Jolly, my successor as well. And we had these conversations with Moyosa, who are a Dutch firm based in the Netherlands who explore these kinds of digital environments for the humanities and for a variety of other purposes too. They're a fascinating group, and this is their third online digital exhibition for the National Gallery. The first one was curated by the director, Gabriele Finaldi, and it was a kind of selection of his favorites from the gallery. It's a very conversational, informal kind of exhibition that people really enjoyed. And the following one was for the Queen's Jubilee, Fit for a Queen. And when the Queen very sadly died in September, it was then slightly updated to be a lasting memorial to the Queen, where the National Gallery's collections are explored in relation to aspects of queenship and spirituality and faith in relation to monarchy as well. And so by the time we got round to this project, Moyosa had learned a number of things, and so had the gallery. And one of the things that we really wanted to do was to not in any way mimic or even really reference any of the architecture inside the gallery. We wanted to do something different. And if you were to take a bird's eye view of the virtual display, you'd see that it's more or less a space in the round, and it has an octagonal form with a series of what we simply referred to as side chapels coming off this main space. And it's got this very simple, slightly classical sort of feel to it. We were very thoughtful about the shades of green, about the temperature, if you like, where and how the weather should be. And I was really clear that I really wanted it to be open to the sky, a little bit like the Oculus in the Pantheon, or like the contemporary work of an artist like James Turrell, who experiments a lot with the boundaries, permeable as they are, between interior and exterior. And as Peter said, this exhibition brings together works of art that are not only usually hundreds of miles away, but are right now hundreds of miles away. It offers the same experience in a way which I hope is really horizontal and appealing to every single person who visits the gallery online. If you are in Hong Kong or in Sunderland, you will be able to see the same thing and experience it in your own way, perhaps even simultaneously. And there's an enormous catalogue that goes along with this project as well. It has, over 25 chapters, over 20 authors from all of our partner institutions and community partners as well, who brought their own perspectives to the collection and the themes associated with it. And I also commissioned a poet, Revd Dr, who is the editor of Jewish Renaissance magazine and has been poet in residence at the British Museum and elsewhere. I commissioned her to craft a poetic response to the gallery and to the themes of the Fruits of the Spirit, and you can find that in the catalogue as well. So we wanted everything to be accessible, free, and usable in teaching for all kinds of people in all sorts of circumstances. And I'm really gratified to see that a number of people, particularly places of worship, have really taken that up. So the Fruits of the Spirit, I need to explain this to lots of audiences, but I am absolutely confident that I don't need to explain this to you. All of you immediately, I'm sure you'll say, yes, Galatians 5, verse 22. If you were thinking that in your head already, good job. I love that a number of you were like, yes, I knew that. So there we are. And there are 9 attributes. St. Paul refers to this list as the fruit of the Spirit. So there was a conversation about whether we should say fruits or fruit. Especially because in English, you can also say a basket of fruit, and that means that you probably have more than one fruit in that basket. So we had a big old chat about this. And what we wanted to do was to demonstrate somehow that it is all one thing, but it is also many things, which is at the heart of Paul's theology in that moment, where he's spending time trying to disentangle a really toxic communal situation with the Galatians and give them some solid teaching about how to look after themselves and how to look after one another. By linking these attributes, so peace, patience, gentleness, kindness, and so on, with love at the beginning, and vitally, self-control at the end, St. Paul is giving us a kind of roadmap, as well as a sort of constellation of possibilities for how living well in community is spirit-led and God-given. All of these fruit, or fruits if you prefer, are gifts that can be used to the best of our ability, individually and collaboratively, and they can also be undermined or distorted. And so if you look at Galatians 5, the list comes in this much bigger context for Paul of considering the pitfalls of the pain of living in a disordered way in community. And so he's suggesting that there is something genuinely loving in its best sense about taking the fruit of the Spirit together as both one thing and multiple. And so those were the sorts of things we were thinking about. The premise of the exhibition, next slide please, is to help people to think about how we look at art and why and how, and perhaps to break down some barriers for people who think that an art gallery might not be for them. And that was where a number of our community partnerships and our more informal conversations with people as the design and the exhibition contents itself were developing. And I've always loved this cartoon. It's by the artist Linda Barry. And I'm not sure whether or not you can all read this, so I'll just have a go and read this out to you and hopefully not mess up the sound for the people online. I'm not sure how to look at art, this parent says. What's supposed to happen, says the child. Something big, a revelation. Suddenly you just understand. Not sure how to make it happen. How about lift me up so I can see better? And there they are. Every mother and child is in some sense the Blessed Virgin Mary and the infant Christ. Every image of the Madonna and child can somehow resonate with what it is to be born, to be alive, and in Christian theology, to keep on living through the sacrificial love of Christ. And there is something so simple about trying to consider what the barriers are to people seeing themselves in works of art, especially in public collections like the National Gallery, whilst also considering that, in a way, we are all there, even in works of art that from their Western, European, almost entirely Christian set of perspectives, seem to be only speaking sometimes to one group of people or one category of experience. And I promise you that that's absolutely not true. And anyone, just about, can get into any work of art and experience some kind of connection. Next slide, please. And so as you start to wander around the gallery, you can see how these different rooms have been organized with their label down the side. And in every single one of these little side chapels, there are just two works of art, one from the National Gallery and one from a public collection. And we worked with Canterbury Cathedral, and I was really keen to work with Canterbury, and you'll see one of Canterbury's altarpieces in this later on. In London with the Ben Uri Gallery and the Foundling Museum, with the Barber in Birmingham, Southampton, the Box in Plymouth, Leicester, the McManus in Dundee, so it's not just England, we went to Scotland too, and the Bowes Museum up in the north of England. Next slide, please. So back to self-control. I was absolutely convinced that I needed to be worried about self-control because that's a pretty unsexy fruit. Who would want that from the point of view of a museum partner? And I remember speaking with colleagues from the Box in Plymouth, which is a marvelous place. If you've not been, you really must go. It's an amazing collection. And we had a number of themes possible for them to choose from. And actually, we all settled pretty quickly on self-control because they wanted to explore it in terms of earth justice, climate change, and the environment. The self-control, which is the self-restraint of not exploiting the planet. And there are a number of pictures in the National Gallery's collection that would work very well with this, and so this was one of our shortlist contenders. And if you want to know more later about how we chose the pictures and how we grouped them together, very happy to discuss that in Q&A if you wish. And so we lighted on J.M.W. Turner's Rain, Steam and Speed from 1844 of a train hurtling along, filled with passengers going at top speed. The train's name was Greyhound. It could reach very impressive speeds, but There is a little hair, which you can't see here, so you'll just have to trust me. You go to the National Gallery and look at it closely. There's a little hair running in front of the train, and the train and the hair at top speed are actually pretty evenly matched. So Turner has set up this kind of shocking drama of who will win. Is it nature or culture? Is it industry or is it the untamed environment? And the way that he painted atmosphere gives us, I think, a real sense of the way in which weather and industry are mixing together. That's why it's got the title that it has. So acrid smoke is mixing together with clouds and sunlight in the air. So the painting itself is an open question. Is this a celebration of progress with its train connecting people between London and Kent, or is it something else? And so the picture on the right is by Ben Hartley, who was a local Devon artist whose work has recently been acquired by Plymouth, and so they really wanted to celebrate this recent acquisition. And Ben Hartley was, and you see two more of his pictures here, so he's very, very excited about the details of life, the simplicity of still life, and a sense of serenity, whether he's painting indoor or outdoor subjects. And this is a lane in Westlake in Devon. And so what Plymouth wanted to do was work together with a group of people locally who were themselves really focused on earth justice and on preservation of the local landscape. And so that group went to that place in Westlake, walked along the road, saw how it had changed in the intervening decades between now and when this picture was painted, and they talked. And out of their conversation, they produced poetry and snippets of these exchanges. And that is their essay in the Fruits of the Spirit catalog. Next slide. Thank you. You'll see that in each of the little pairs, there's also a quotation. And the quotations come from all over the place. Evelyn Underhill, Rowan Williams, but also Muslim and Jewish sources and secular sources as well as art history. There's a quote by Michelangelo in there somewhere too. And this was the first pair that I came up with. Some of you may be familiar with both of these paintings or one of them. The Titian on the left is a Madonna and Child that's from quite a late stage in Titian's career. It's very feathery in the way that it's painted, very soft. There are no halos. It appears to be quite an ordinary mother and child. It's not a big painting. It's a painting that seems to display the infant Christ in the most everyday way possible. And when I've looked at this picture with mothers, they say that the rosiness in Christ's cheeks suggests that he might be teething. So he's hungry, he's teething. I love the idea of the infant Jesus teething. That's beautiful. And we put it together with this picture by a Jewish artist named Ernst Neuschel. And Neuschel was in Germany in the early 1930s. He was a member of the November group of artists, and Leicester has a vast and excellent collection of German expressionist painting. So we wanted to highlight that collection with them, as well as highlighting this extremely striking image of a black mother and child, and she is feeding her baby in a park in Berlin in 1931. By placing this image next to the Titian, it's completely evident immediately, if it wouldn't have been already, that Neuschel is absolutely entering this mother and child into the long tradition of that sacred holy family of the Madonna and Jesus. The everydayness for them is a different kind of everydayness, and there's a lovely correspondence between the ribbon on the baby's collar and the ribbon on the mother's hat, which suggests a kind of halo, the vivid greens with the light in behind, creating this kind of holy, almost transcendent atmosphere. And then there are their expressions. Between these two pairs, what is being felt? What is childhood like, and what is motherhood like? I asked my colleague at the National Gallery, Kendall Francis, who is a paintings conservator who now works at the Getty and who is also a black British woman, to explore this picture with me. And she came up with this, and this is in the catalogue as well. Here's Kendall. I can see the pride and celebratory strength in her eyes. which for Black and ethnic minority women is vital. Seeing ourselves in power within historical artworks is rare. But I can also see fear eliciting the problematic stereotype of the strong, angry Black woman who is not as sensitive to pain and in need of less nurturing and protection. For me, Kendall says, this artwork also brings forth the centuries of Black women and enslaved women forced to be wet nurses for white children, and the continued fatal discrimination Black mothers and babies still endure to this day. As I mentioned earlier, there are community projects associated with all of these pairs, and in Leicester, they decided to do some social media crowdsourcing to find out what various people thought about this picture. Here is what Sadiq thought. I see a brave portrait going against the norms of the time. In the 1930s, the Nazis were in power. When I identify with this woman, I am less sure. Is she looking alert? Is she threatened? Is she defiant and proud? Personally, I see fear and anxiety. I imagine she was very afraid of having her portrait done at this time, especially because she is in such a vulnerable position, breastfeeding her child. Try looking from the different perspectives of the artist and the sitter and see how you feel. So that was Sadiq's response in Leicester to his encounter with this picture. Next slide, please. Looking up close, you can see these rosy cheeks. And you can see a rather enigmatic expression on the Virgin Mary's face. The shawl is simple, and the clothing seems to meld into the background in some places, and the palette is very restricted. It's a very dark picture. And one of the former directors of the National Gallery said in 1924, when it was acquired as part of the Mond collection, which has a Jewish heritage itself, that the picture was lit from within by dark and murky fires. It's a beautiful painting. Next slide. And together with this picture, both of these paintings seem to sing in a different kind of harmony. They strike a chord with one another. And one of the great joys of the virtual gallery exhibition is being able to explore them together in this way. But one of my great hopes is that one day, either in Leicester or in London, the real thing will be together. And it would be fascinating to see what people's experiences of that encounter with these four people mirrored in one another might be. Next slide, please. This is faithfulness, and so here, Julian of Norwich, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. Julian of Norwich combines and holds together this Oratio Gentileschi, the finding of Moses, which I mentioned at the beginning. So this was the picture that was also taken up by the Interfaith Network and the curators for our various seminars and films and events, and with a marvelous picture of Isabella, Duchess of Manchester, by the Italian artist Andrea Soldi from the Foundling collection. And it's that picture that I'd like to focus on for a moment. Next slide, please. I hope that all of you have been to the Foundling Museum. And if you haven't, I warmly recommend that you go. It's not far, it's in Bloomsbury. And it was established by Thomas Coram in the early 18th century, but not without an enormous fight and struggle. One of the reasons why many people thought that it was not a good idea, in fact, even outrageous, perhaps sinful, to set up a foundling hospital for infants who would otherwise be abandoned and who might die or suffer enormously. One of the reasons why the idea of a hospital and an institution for education for children was not such a good idea for some is because they believed that it would encourage mothers to be promiscuous. And I hope that we all think that that's an absolutely crazy and outrageous thing. But in the early 18th century, that was actually it's an argument that a lot of people wanted to make. And so people fought for a very long time, including the Duchess of Manchester, for the foundling to be able to rise. And one of the people who was really instrumental with this was George Frederick Handel, who was very supportive of the foundling. And William Hogarth, the artist, was also very engaged with the Foundling and their vision. During the 2 centuries that the hospital was open, they looked after 25,000 children. The museum is situated on the grounds of the old hospital, and it was opened a number of years ago as a new way of celebrating the work, not only of the Foundling Hospital and Thomas Coram, but also of the continued work to support people who have been through the care system and children who need care at various points in their lives. And so for the community side of the Fruits of the Spirit exhibition, someone named Hania, who was part of the creative writing internship program at the Foundling Museum, which is a very powerful and profound thing for them to be doing, Hania wrote a beautiful commentary on this portrait. Here is some of that commentary. Dressed as Diana, Roman goddess of the hunt, childbirth, and women, Isabella Montague is a powerful emblem of drive and steadfastness. To be standing in front of her painting hundreds of years later is an incredible experience for me as a young woman who was in the care system. The efforts of Isabella, Duchess of Manchester, to support the creation of the Foundling Hospital strike a sensitive chord that had until recently remained dormant under the many layers of my withdrawn heart. The museum gives leavers like me a place to connect with similar people and a space to explore their experiences in a cathartic way through art and storytelling. What better place to do that than the very museum which champions the first ever home that proffered its hand to the abandoned? Such an environment feels like a warm hand reaching out to the most vulnerable parts of myself and comforts me in a way I didn't know I needed. To be aware of the stories of those who came before me feels like looking into what life could have been like for me. I feel I must now show faithfulness in making the most of what I have. The efforts of Isabella and the other ladies are still felt in the warmth and walls of the Foundling Museum. The strength of such devotion to helping those in need that I feel from them reverberates in the chambers of a reserved but hopeful 19-year-old girl's heart. It was an absolute joy for all of us at the National Gallery to invite people like Hania to contribute to this project, not only with their own lived experiences, but also in full engagement with the works of art and with St. Paul's letter to the Galatians. That multi-layered experience encouraged people to be able to think differently about themselves as well as the works of art. And I hope that that's the case for everyone who visits the exhibition and spends time with these works of art, I hope slowly looking at them. And I would love to know now, very briefly, how long do you think is the average amount of time that someone who goes to a museum looks at a picture? Just pop your hand up if you think you know. Yes? 90 seconds, Father. 3 seconds. You're not far off. 2 seconds. They look at the picture for 2 seconds, and then they spend an average of 10 seconds reading the label, and then they move on. So anything that you can manage above 2 seconds is officially counterculturally transgressive, and you'd be a high achiever if you looked at a picture for longer than that. And what we're trying to do in our exhibition is encourage people to slow down and to learn about the stories of communities around them, as well as the works of art and themselves. Next slide, please. And so I just wanted to draw your attention briefly to a film that's connected to this, and please do go and take a look at it on the National Gallery's website. And I won't tell you very much about this picture because it's such a wonderful thing to discover for yourselves, except to say very briefly that these women who are gesturing off to the right, surrounding Moses, who has just been brought out of the river by the enslaved woman who is kneeling on the right, those women are pointing now in the National Gallery, when the painting is on the wall, to some other 17th century picture. But originally, because the painting was produced for the court of Charles I in the early 1630s, in order to celebrate the birth of Charles II, these women would have actually been pointing out the window on the ground floor of the Queen's house to the Thames. And so this is an utterly London picture. And that partially explains why it looks like some sort of verdant national trust property in the back with that little strip of blue rather than like the Nile in Egypt. Because there's a point being made here about the life of Moses and the expectation of leadership. It's a complex theological point because of the complexity of Moses' own life and liberation and the Israelites in Egypt and the way that that might map on to aspects of the state, politics, and monarchy. I think that's another lecture for another time, but it was a delight to be able to include this picture in the exhibition and to think about it. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Oh, you've got it. Sorry. That's my next slide. I should do my next slide, please. There we are. Being obsessed with Evelyn Underhill as I am, I had to get an Evelyn Underhill quote into the exhibition, and here a very beautiful one from her. The beating of a heart, the upleap of joy, greater than anything that we have known. And so on the left here, Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and on the right, a picture by Frank Auerbach from the Ben Uri Gallery, which is a collection of primarily work by Jewish artists that celebrates and explores histories and stories of migration. For sunflowers, every stalk, petal, and seed is different, and the palette of yellows with touches of blue seem to be restrained and simple, but Van Gogh compared them to a symphony and described the whole series of sunflowers that he painted. He painted several. They're now in museums all over the world, and this is the National Galleries here from 1888. He described them as being like stained glass windows, which I think is so beautiful. Frank Auerbach, not in the south of France, but in Mornington Crescent, just down the street from Camden Town, with all of its hurry and all of its urban qualities, Frank Auerbach has been painting the same scenes out his window in that same local place where he's at his studio for 70 years. And here, clearly, he was just overtaken with delight by a sunny morning in 2004. Next slide, please. So taking a closer look, you can also see that especially in the Auerbach painting, there is so much paint. You may have seen some of his work, his building site paintings from the 1950s when London was still really very damaged and ravaged by the trauma of war. The paintings are so thick that effectively they're sculptures. And some say that some of his pictures, the paint never fully dried and gravity continues to slightly drag it down. So here it's not quite that, but we do have this really rich, full, generous use of paint. And Van Gogh, in a slightly more gentle way, does likewise. So when you see this painting in the National Gallery, you'll see its thickness and its exuberance. But a National Gallery recently remarked to me that he doesn't think that Van Gogh's Sunflowers is joyful at all. He sees joy in the Auerbach, but a lot of the sunflowers that Van Gogh painted here are dead or dying. So where the joy is in that may be difficult to spot. Van Gogh was a Christian, knew his Bible incredibly well, preached and was here in London doing just that, and was really focusing always on the relationship between the natural world and creation as God-given. And so for him, when he was really enthusiastic about sunflowers, he didn't just want to paint the ones that were in full bloom and perfect. I think he loved their imperfection, and he loved the way that these were getting us into the big, deep questions about cycles of life. And I think he most certainly was considering what Jesus had to say about a grain of wheat falling into the ground and dying, and only then can it bear new life. And so there is a joy in the anticipation of the eternal and of new life, even in the appearance of a brown seed head, faded, struggling, and dying. Next slide, please. This Monet picture, I hope many of you will be familiar with. I highly recommend spending half an hour with it in the gallery. If you have half an hour, just be there and see what happens, and something will happen, I promise you. Monet painted his Water Lilies series in Giverny as a response to the First World War and its trauma. The violence, like for so many, completely undid him. He was terrified that his son would die in battle. He, at that point, was struggling with bereavement. He was struggling with cataracts. His vision was going. And so he decided to erect this giant warehouse and to paint. He described the series as a monument to peace, So this effectively is Monet's peace protest. And he gave a series of these to the French government at the armistice, and you may have seen these in the Orangerie in Paris. And this one, together with a number of others around the world, was then later acquired by other galleries. So this one, I think, was acquired by the National Gallery in the 1960s. It's infinite, really. It could expand in any direction beyond its frame. And if you get it just right, and this is true digitally, virtually, as well as in person, if you get it just right, you can be completely surrounded by this picture, immersed in the pond, which seems to have no beginning and no end. And that's very different from the picture that we paired it with on the right. And this is the altarpiece in Canterbury Cathedral, Winifred Knight's St. Martin of Tours. Next slide, please. Winifred Knight, if you've not heard of her, is one of the greatest British modern artists, and she just happens to be a woman, if I can put it like that. And she won the Rome Prize for painting from the Slade in 1920 and spent 3 years in Italy. She was the first woman to do this, and she was not an especially prolific painter, but her oeuvre, her output, is really stunning and really biblically articulate and thoughtful. And has any of you ever seen this altarpiece in Canterbury Cathedral before? No. That's because Canterbury Cathedral is huge and full of stuff. And so I don't blame you. But the next time you go, please do take a look. And I've given you this map. Let's see. I don't have a pointer, but I'm just going to use my finger. I'm going to do this old-fashioned, and hopefully I'm tall enough. It is that one. So it's this chapel there. And so the picture, next slide please, was painted between 1928 and 1933. And it was painted as a memorial, but really it was also painted as a kind of a critique of the First World War. And the most famous act of St. Martin of Tours is when he gives half of his cloak to a beggar. And so we see that over on the left. But Knight has pushed this out of the center. So the symbol, the iconography that you would expect to see is not in the middle. And we have to look for it a little bit. And St. Martin as a military saint, and of course Armistice Day and St. Martin's Day, they're connected together very deeply and vividly as well. Here he's wearing a First World War helmet, so that's being made very clear here, though the palette and the composition is really inspired by Italian artists like Piero della Francesca, which Knight's deeply admired. And then on the other side of the picture, in its own separate kind of architectural space, is a vision of Christ wearing the cloak. So this is part of the hagiography, the biography of St. Martin. In the center, a lesser known but extremely powerful story of St. Martin bringing a dead child back to life. And there's something of an image of the Holy Family here. But we have St. Martin, and we have this mother, and we have a baby not lively, but just as holy, surely, in a circumstance like this, just as sacred. And in the very moment, that's my little clock telling me that I'm nearly done, which is good because I really am nearly done. And in this moment, glorious picture, and also mathematically incredibly complex. So there's a wonderful one-to-one scale drawing that I recently saw in the Liss Llewellyn collection, and Sasha Llewellyn is the world expert on Winifred Knights. If you want to know more about Knights, her book on Winifred Knights is very fine, and she very happily, we were very fortunate that she said that she would write our catalog essay for this picture, for the Fruits of the Spirit exhibition. And so that one-to-one drawing shows these absolutely incredibly complicated geometrical lines. And indeed, Piero della Francesca was also an absolute expert in the relationship between mathematics and the art of painting. And so what I want to do, by way of ending, is to give you a little bit of one of our other community authors. So this is Rishan Sige, who arrived in Kent as a refugee, as a young person, and now supports other refugees and asylum seekers in and around Canterbury. She says, I go to the Egyptian Coptic St. Michael and St. Bishoy Church in Margate. For me, peace is when I have a connection with God. It's been 2 weeks since I was able to attend church. In that time, I can feel the buildup of stress as I deal with my university course and other things I have going on. Stress makes me forget what is happening within me. until I realize that I need to go back and have that time of peace with God. I appreciate it when people realize that as refugees, people like me may have had an upsetting or traumatizing time on our journeys to where we are today. I know not everyone sees our situation like that, but it's good to be able to dig inside ourselves and share peace with others. It is much better to live like that. Sometimes when we face prejudice or negativity, it can feel like more of a challenge than the journey to get here in the first place. The scenes depicting St. Martin's life have different emotions. He is experiencing joy and happiness when he sees an angel. Then in the middle scene, people are looking down in their grief and sadness because of the child. They seem powerless. Thinking of my story, it makes me think of the grief I suffered during my journey to the UK. I lost one of my friends in Libya. As refugees, we often carry grief with us in ways that are not visible. For nights, I hope that the beauty of her painting, the colors in the landscape, the snowdrops, all symbolize her life too. The child in the painting may be grey, but hopefully Nights, who lost a child herself, knew there was a wider world out there, and that painting this helped her find her way back to it. I'm going to stop there, and I really hope that you've enjoyed looking at some of these pictures from the Fruits of the Spirit exhibition, and that it will encourage you to go and see the paintings in the National Gallery and to go to the virtual exhibition and spend time there, hopefully more than 2 seconds per picture, and to really enjoy what they bring out for you as well as what they've brought out for others. So thank you so much.
Many thanks indeed for a really excellent, splendid lecture. Could I invite, there's about 30 people online. If anybody online would like to ask a question, please just pop it into the live chat bit at the bottom of the YouTube video, and we can ask those questions in person. Now we move to a time for questions. Are there any thoughts or questions in the house? Shall I leave you to...
Yes, and when you've got a question, I will repeat the question back for the benefit of people online as well. So if you're wondering why I'm doing that and you're thinking, gosh, that's annoying, it's actually so our online folk can join in as well. Yes, please.
I learned my vicar at home taught me to remember all the fruits of the Spirit with the NIV. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control.
Yes. Brilliant.
I saw on your thing, your display, that you have generosity as a fruit of the Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering which one that would take, because it's not in the ones that I learned.
Yeah, no, generosity is there. Generosity is absolutely. Yeah. Goodness. Mm-hmm. So it has to do with Greek translation. So in the NIV, goodness, and in the NRSV, generosity. Fascinating. So this is one of those moments where I'm like, break out the interlinear. Let's do it. I hate to put you on the spot, Father, but and I should repeat this as well. So the question is that this gentleman learned the fruits of the Spirit off by heart using the New International Version of the Bible and was wondering where generosity comes in. And it has to do with the amazingness of different English translations from the original Greek text. So generosity in the NRSV is goodness in the NIV, which is it's fascinating. And it makes me wonder how different translations are what they are. So go on, Peter. What is that word? Do you remember? Oh, thank you for that. Other questions? Yes.
What is apparently a child
Oh.
The other question is, to what extent do galleries, if at all, have an audio loop which they play in a particular gallery, telling us about the picture and trying to awaken our interest and enthusiasm, etc., as opposed to the technology of the hearing platforms?
Yeah, marvelous question. So the first thing is that he's noticing that the dead child in the foreground looks like a lamb, and I think it's really interesting that it looks like that to you. I think different people pull things visually in paintings in all sorts of different ways, and now I'm wondering about that myself. I've never seen that before, but I'd like to take a closer look. So I like that. I think it's really interesting, especially if you wanted to push that in terms of sacrifice and innocence and those imagery, that kind of Christ-like imagery. The other question was about audio material in galleries and the way that audio material can help people to enter into a picture in a different way. And I'm so glad you asked me, because there is a free audio guide accompanying this exhibition. Robert, I know you're not a plant and that really was a real question, but I'm thrilled by the question nonetheless.
Is that one you have to rent?
No. All you need is a phone. So when you're in the gallery proper, and you're looking at Van Gogh's sunflowers, there is a special Fruits of the Spirit label next to it that has some text which relates to the theme, and I hope it encourages people to kind of think about it thematically. And then there's a QR code, and if you hover your phone over the QR code, it'll take you to the audio guide. And the audio guide is also inside the virtual gallery itself, where when you wander through the virtual gallery's rooms, you can click on a little headphones icon, and sound will occur. Yes.
So that's divorced from reality. I'm thinking it would be really helpful and effective for appreciation, art appreciation, if the sound came in the room. That obviously could only happen with only one painting on display.
Yeah, well, that brings up another thing. And for the folks online, what he's saying is that it would be really lovely and possibly more accessible, perhaps, if as you approached a painting in the gallery, it would just sound occurred. So perhaps, and you could do it. You could do it with a motion sensor, and then sound occurs. And there are a number of special exhibitions that do that. And there's technology using sound cones and various things like that. And thankfully, technology is getting better, because one of the problems, of course, is when sound kind of ripples out and it becomes cacophonous, or it becomes difficult to quite get a grip on what's happening in terms of an aural experience of a work of art. But it's brilliant when it works. And to be able to simply stand there and not have to do a thing with a device can be really immersive in itself. So it's a good point. Yes? I've been asked whether or not I have a favorite work of art in the exhibition, and whether or not there were any that didn't make it. The favorite changes for me all the time, and that's not just because I'm saying they're like my children, I don't have favorites. It genuinely changes, because it changes for me depending on who is with me and what kinds of conversations are coming out of it, actually. And I will admit that right now, my favorite one is one that I did not show you because I did not have time, but Peter knows what it is, so shall we go forward? Yeah. Oh, keep going. Yep, and keep going one more. Yes, good. Okay, so this is the Prayer for Generosity. The Arnolfini on the left, what a showstopper of a painting. Millions and millions of people. It's got, posters everywhere, all sorts of things. And I would love to take you through why I chose this for generosity, but you're just going to have to ask me afterwards if you really want to know. Because actually, my favorite painting right now is the one on the right. It's by an artist called Ron Stenberg. How many people have heard of Ron Stenberg? Yeah, not so much. I hadn't either. He taught in the art school at Dundee for many years, and this is in the McManus in that city. And he called it Twa Old Wifies, two old ladies. And they're on a bench in a 1960s shopping center outside of Boots. And when the picture was acquired by the McManus, there was a lot of curiosity about who they were. And they are not two old women at all. They're a mother and son. And what looks like a skirt on the right, those brown stripes, they're actually standard issue pajamas from the Lith Hospital in Dundee, where Alexander lived because he had profound disabilities that affected him for the whole of his life. And so effectively he was institutionalized in this space for many, many years. And every week his mother Janet would come and spend time with him, and they would go for a walk in town, maybe go shopping, and then they'd sit on the bench and chat. And that's what Ron Stenberg saw, not having known who they were. And so this is a kind of an appearances can be deceiving puzzle of a picture. And it's also a picture about family, about closeness, and it's also about eccentricity to an extent. I love the way both of them are dressed. It's just brilliant. And the way that they seem so at ease in themselves, in the conversation, in their bodies. As far as generosity is concerned, people, of course, often and tragically still do, put folks with disabilities of various kinds on the very margins of social life in a variety of ways. And in Dundee, people did so for Janet as well. She was someone who struck a variety of folks as being just not someone who belonged, a little odd, an outsider. Despite that, when Janet died, it turned out that she was quite wealthy. And so she gave a significant amount of money to the city of Dundee so that they could use it to support charitable projects and community outreach projects, and they still do that. So that's why, for many reasons, this is my favorite picture in the exhibition right now. One that didn't make it, Bridget Riley's Messengers. I really would have loved to have that in the exhibition. If you know the National Gallery, you'll know that by the shop in the newest part of the gallery near the Getty entrance, there's something called the Annenberg Court. And it's huge, vast white walls with a skylight above, and then these beautiful black marble steps going up in a kind of a viewing platform. And the walls are covered in polka dots. It's a 10 by 20 meter mural by Bridget Riley, and it's called Messengers because that's what Constable, the painter, called clouds. And so she was very interested in weather systems, in changing patterns. And these dots, initially, it looks like they have no pattern at all, that they're random. But the more you spend time with them, way more than 2 seconds, the more they begin to move and even dance in the eye, because the starkness of the white wall against the dot means that there are constant retinal impressions, flashes of the echoes of the dots that you just saw. So as your eye moves around, you have the dots on the wall, and then the background forming a kind of canvas for the light impressions, the after effects of the dots in your eyes as you blink. And I would have loved to have done that for Joy, but there was no way, really, that we could figure out quite how to make it work in the environment, and then there would be questions for Bridget Riley's gallery, and we thought, oh, that would be great. And then we thought, nope, we're going to have to do something else. And I love that Van Gogh's Sunflowers is in the exhibition. It's become the kind of flagship work of art for the exhibition. It's the image that people really warm to in a variety of ways. But I have to admit, I'm very sorry, Vincent van Gogh, but you were second choice. So there we go. Yes?
Can I take you back to the painting that represented the fruit of love?
Yeah.
Particularly the one before, obviously, was the one of the black woman with the black child.
Sure. Peter, would you like to go back to that? That would be great.
Portrait by Sadiq, is that his name?
Yeah.
Yes, yes. And it seems to focus on the black woman. Is there any significance of the sort of depiction of the black child, he or she, which gender it is, seems to show fear as well, but it's also looking away, compared to the other picture, they're both looking away from each other. But is there any sort of story in the way the child is depicted? Can you say anything about that at all?
Yeah. So the question is that for the painting, which is titled Black Mother, is there a story about the way that the child is depicted? And you've noticed that the child's also looking away, has a sense of fearfulness. And yeah, there's a story. I've not come across anything that tells me, what Ernst Neuschel thought he was doing when he was looking at the expressions of the mother and the child. It's quite open-ended. I see fear in that child's eyes. I also see curiosity. A kind of just wondering what's going on. And I've never breastfed before. I don't have a child. I don't know what that's like. But when I've explored this picture with women who have, they say that that child is distracted to the extent that he's about to come off the breast, actually, which would be pretty inconvenient and difficult for that mother because she's trying to feed her baby in a public place, in a space of danger, which is becoming politically more dangerous for her and her child by the day. And so there's something about both of these figures being interrupted, and that interruption potentially being a very distressing or even violent interruption. Who is interrupting them? Us. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. I find the picture really moving and also really confrontational. It encourages me to ask more and I hope better questions about theology in relation to race and family and cultural history. It helps me to remember that, of course, the Blessed Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus were not white. They too were people of color. They too were people in a situation of extraordinary and terrifying oppression and pressures. And to be able to really consider that, I think helps us to open some questions in relation to the Titian. And instead of thinking, gosh, what a pretty picture of this beautiful mother and child, thinking about both of these together, one approach is to look at Titian and think, what are you doing? Do you not know that the Madonna and child were in a state of frequent danger, were in a state of marginalization and significant distress, as well as deep joy and utter glory, surrounded by and immersed in the holy love of God? Do you not know that both of these things are true at once? So I think these paintings are in a big conversation with each other, and perhaps that, in this case, they've never been put together except in this exhibition, so there's lots of places we could go, except in this case. There is this really, really big story here, which I wonder, if you... I'm going to try this out. If the infant Christ, in the picture on the left, were to turn towards the mother and child, in the picture on the right, what impact might that have on the emotional, the psychological, the spiritual experience of the mother and child on the right, being regarded with tenderness and love by the hungry, teething, tiny Son of God? I don't know. But I think it's worth considering, and it's one of the reasons why these kinds of juxtapositions can take us somewhere. I hope somewhere useful. Yep.
Just on this painting, do you know the exact circumstances of how he was painting? Because one presumes it's not on plein air, it's not got his easel out in the park, because she wouldn't have been able to hold that position for long enough. So, I actually think they're both looking at the artist.
Mm-hmm.
And you take a photograph, are they thinking, what are you doing? I'm breastfeeding, go away.
Mm-hmm.
Horrible man. Why are you taking my photograph? I mean, do we know any of that?
So the question is, what were the circumstances for Ernst Neuschel creating this picture? Was he painting it outside? Did he use a photograph? Was he painting it with models in a studio? This is a very dissatisfying answer, and I am truly sorry. I don't know. I don't know. He certainly had a studio and was working in the studio a lot, and so what I'm guessing, I don't know. But what I'm guessing is that he saw a mother and child perhaps breastfeeding in the park, and he thought, gosh, what a subject, and then would have worked with a model in order to pose and to work it out and to think it through. That's what I suspect. He painted a number of pictures, especially in this period, that were utterly politically defiant. And he really had to escape with his easel and some of his favorite pictures and not much else. He was under enormous pressure himself for obvious reasons. And so I'm really not sure how he painted this and what the circumstances were. But I suspect that as someone who was deeply engaged in the urgent quest for social observation, he was definitely inspired by something that happened, and then he thought, how am I going to paint this? That's my best guess. Yes?
You could say that picture on the right was some photojournalism, not really art. I just
Sure. So just to make sure that I've got this, you're saying that this painting is photojournalism and not art, is that right?
It's a different type of picture, isn't it, from the one on the left?
I suppose so. Yeah. So the idea is that the picture on the right is making a statement in a different sort of way from the picture on the left. And I think part of what you're asking, if I've got this right, is whether or not pictures like this one were selected specifically because of their social justice message as well as what they are. Is that right? I believe that every good painting has a social justice message, that a bit like Christianity, art is not apolitical, that it can't be. And certainly, this picture on the right has a story to tell about racism, about fear, about family, about people who are under pressure in a space which is becoming increasingly dangerous moment by moment, for sure. That is a different context from the Titian on the left, absolutely. There is also no question in my mind that I was deliberately choosing works of art, some of which, like this one, are very famous in their own right. And then I was deliberately, but like the Ron Stenberg in Dundee, locally famous, but who has heard of Ron Stenberg? No one. I was deliberately choosing pictures that would open out big conversations and that were also pictures of exceptionally high quality. And talking about like what is good art and what isn't and what taste means is a whole other conversation and a very important one. But I wanted to ensure that all of the paintings that were chosen could stand up to, could be alongside a National Gallery picture which is always referred to as an old master or as one of our greatest hits or as one of the icons of the National Gallery. Some would say that an altarpiece by Winifred Knight, who's she, really shouldn't be alongside Monet's Water Lilies because it's so incredible. And I completely disagree. And sometimes I think there are moments in this exhibition where if one is thinking along the lines of what's better, it's not always the National Gallery picture for a number of different reasons, and I think we need to be open to that. I was giving a lecture in a very different setting earlier this week, and someone in Q&A said, have you noticed that the National Gallery's pictures are always on the left, and that people read left-right? So the National Gallery's paintings always, in the way that we read and in the way that we look in this culture, in this society, the National Gallery's paintings always come first, and the partner paintings always come second. Did you do that deliberately? And I thought, oh my gosh, we got it completely wrong. Did not do it deliberately, and should have mixed it up in all kinds of different ways. We should not have done it like that. And I think that that was such a wise and such a thoughtful observation, because what she said was that effectively we've kind of built in the power of here's the good one, and here's the interesting one. She didn't say it like that, but the more that I've thought about it over the last however many hours, the more I've thought, we should have done it differently. Are there any questions online?
There aren't that I can see. They don't appear to be in the chat, in the live chat. Might we draw the evening to a close?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much indeed. May we show our appreciation? Gosh, there's so much that's whizzing around my head now, all the sort of thoughts that you've prompted me to think. Thank you so much for a really, really interesting evening. And thank you for, this whole project is absolutely first rate and was really, really terrific. And I personally had such a wonderful experience going through it and looking at the pictures. It's complete genius, and it really is excellent. So thank you so much for a really wonderful and fascinating project. Now we have a little gift you may not know this, but lecturing makes you very thirsty. So there's a bottle there that will help slake that thirst, and a small book token to say thank you from us to you for all that you've offered to us tonight. So many, many thanks indeed. Thank you very much indeed, everybody. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, that's really nice. It's such an interesting
yes, yes. So amazing.